looking at two parashot in one Shabbat. So clearly it is not possible in the time that we have available to be able to address the features of each of these two portions. Even our readings today were reduced to just two chapters in the second portion, in Parashah 43, because that relates to the subject that I want to talk about this morning. The subjects I want to focus on are chapter 33 and 34. However, that does not mean that the other parts that are stepped over are not important. It's important that we read those at home. So looking firstly at chapter 33, it recounts the places visited in the wilderness, but I won't be going over each one of them. But rather I'll be focusing on the significance of a couple of verses that I think are the basis of a very interesting geographical study. And then we move on to chapter 34, which sets forth the borders of the land of Canaan, which constitute, of course, the boundaries of what still applies in this modern day as Eretz-Yisra'el. So starting in chapter 33, we see that Moshe is looking back over the whole journey from Egypt to the plains of Moab, where he has listed all the places that Israel visited. The whole chapter 33 is devoted to 40 different points or stages in Israel's journey where they stopped, rested, and moved on in their journey from Egypt to the plains of Moab. And it is strange because the chapter has no direct bearing on anything being considered in any of the surrounding chapters. The rabbis have offered many explanations as to why Yahweh required Moshe to record all those staging points, as the list appears to have no real benefit for that second generation, and nor does it appear to have any other place in Scripture. So, I would like to offer my explanation as to the possible reason why this was put in as part of Torah. As it appears to have no bearing on Israel at any stage in the past, I believe it has a purpose for times yet to be fulfilled. When the people of Israel and all the peoples of the nations are resurrected into the 1,000-year reign of Yeshua, that will be the time of an awakening process, and I believe it will be progressive. I mean by that I see the last to die will be some of the first to be resurrected, going backwards towards Adam. This line of reasoning may well tie back with the words of Yeshua when he said, in response to Kepha's question about the future, Yeshua's Talmudim were gathered together, and Kepha asked in Matthew chapter 19, verses 27 to 30, which starts with a question from Kepha. He said, "Look, we have left everything and followed you. So what will we have?" Yeshua said to them, "Yes, I tell you that in the regenerated world, when the Son of Man sits on his glorious throne, and you who have followed me will also sit on 12 thrones and judge the 12 tribes of Israel. Everyone who has left his house, brother, sister, father, mother, for my sake, will receive 100 times more, and he will obtain eternal life. But anyone who is first will be last. Anyone who is last will be first." Now, if my reasoning about the reverse order of resurrection is correct, it would be a benefit to all those who are part of that first generation of Israel. Most of them lived out their lives in the wilderness and died in that same wilderness during that 38 years of wandering. Because of all those 20 years and older died in the wilderness, they never entered to Eretz-Yisra'el as we know it today. So they would not be recognized by subsequent generations in the restored Israel. Unless, of course, their territorial identity could be proven, they would have remained as a lost generation forever. So, what better way than to show that they truly were part of Israel and had an identity by naming the places where they lived and died in the wilderness south of the region of Eretz-Yisra'el. After all, Abraham, Yitzhak and Yaakov had all lived in the heart of Canaan, and their history is well documented through the Torah of Moshe. Abraham and Yaakov even bought pieces of land in the southern and northern regions of the Promised Land, so they would be well recognized as part of the family of Israel. As more and more people are brought back through the resurrection into the community of Israel, they would certainly be recognized. But only that first generation that never crossed the Yarden and never became dwellers in the land would have to prove that they truly were part of ancient Israel. So I believe it was no accident that Moshe warned that first generation what lay ahead of them. When they were preparing to depart from Mount Horev and head north towards the Promised Land, he said to them in Shemot, Exodus 23, verses 29 through 30, I will not drive them, that is the people of the land, out before you in 1 year, which would cause the land to become desolate and the wild animals too many for you. I will drive them out gradually until you have grown in number and can take possession of the land. Yahweh then went on to outline the borders of the land that Yahweh had promised to Abraham over 430 years earlier. Yahweh said through Moshe in verse 31, I will set boundaries from the Sea of Suf to the Sea of the Philistine, and from the desert to the river. For I will hand the inhabitants of the land over to you, and you will drive them out before you. Now there are two important boundaries that Moshe mentions there. And they are the two seas, the Sea of Suf and the Sea of the Philistine. Those two seas are significant because together they form the eastern and western limits of the southern border, which is also the territory which that first generation of Israel actually sojourned over that 38 years of wandering. So in reality, they had lived and died in what later became the Negev. Therefore, if the promise made earlier by Moshe had been ringing in the ears of those spies when they reconnoitred the land, they would have enjoyed the land of promise, but they failed to listen. That brings me back to the words of today's Parashah, where Moshe mentions, among all the places of that first generation passed through, we see from the first 15 verses of chapter 33 that Moshe details the route taken by the people of Israel from Egypt to Mount Horev. Now we'll put up that slide. We see here is Ramesses and the area where Israel started their journey through Sukkot and then through, what is that? Etam, sorry. And then they started backwards and they came across behind the Gulf of Suez, crossed over, and then went 3 days' journey into the desert before they started tracking southward again, where they actually came to the Sea of Suf for the second time. That, I believe, was the journey. And as we see in the midpoint of that whole journey, we're told in the second encounter with the Sea of Suf, in verse 10, Moshe says, they moved from Elam and camped at the sea by the Sea of Suf. Then in verse 11 he says, and they moved from the Sea of Suf and camped in the Sin desert. And from there, in verse 12, they moved from the Sin desert and camped at the Dofka, which is right up the top. Dofka appears to be situated north of the modern city of Eilat. So the important feature is that Moshe appears to have led Israel on a wide circle, that they were going, and it appeared they were going to make a second crossing over the Red Sea. But instead, he led them round the top of what is now the Gulf of Aqab. So the question must be asked, why did he lead them half to that place, halfway up the Gulf of Aqab? If he knew that they had to make another crossing, was he expecting to open the waters a second time? No. We see from the map that assuming that Mount Horev is almost opposite the place where they came to the second point of the Red Sea, or the Sea of Suf, Moshe should have known well that they would not be able to reach Mount Horev by taking that route unless they had to cross through the waters a second time. So either Yahweh was going to perform that miracle a second time and open the waters of the Gulf of Aqab, as he had done earlier in the Gulf of Suez, or something else had to happen. So we must remember that Moshe had had his first encounter with Yahweh at the burning bush, and that burning bush was actually at Mount Horev. Then after that encounter, he was told to go back to Egypt. So he knew where Mount Horev was, and that the route he had taken back to Egypt. So why did he lead Israel to the middle of the Gulf of Aqab on that Exodus journey? It seems logical that on his way back to Egypt, Moshe had not encountered a body of water at that location. Even the Talmud suggests that the Gulf of Aqab could well have been transformed from a river into a gulf at the same time as the crossing of the Gulf of Suez. A major earthquake at the time of the crossing may well have occurred, which formed the Gulf of Aqab. So I'll leave you to ponder that one, and the possibility of why Israel marched so far to the north and ended up in battle with the Amalekites as they went around the top of the Gulf of Aqab, close to the territory of Edom. Now I want to move on and consider the borders of Canaan itself, as they appear and are defined in chapter 34. In chapter 34, verse 1 and 2, Yahweh told Moshe to give orders to the people of Israel that when you enter the land of Canaan, it will become your land of possession to pass on as an inheritance. The land of Canaan is defined by these borders. Then in verses 3 through 12, Moshe defines the southern, western, northern and eastern borders. Many locations mentioned no longer exist, but it is clear that the territory within the confines of those defined boundaries are fairly similar, but definitely more extensive than the disputed territories of the modern state of Israel. Like the places defined in chapter 33, so also the place names of Israel's borders will be defined again during the 1,000-year reign of Yeshua. And as I said earlier, as the people of Israel are awoken from the sleep of death, they will be confronted with the reality that had been established way back then, at that time of that second generation who stood on the plains of Moab. And what was being defined in chapter 34 will again be the real territory of Eretz-Yisra'el. So we see from the place names of both chapter 33 and chapter 34 are profoundly important. Also, today's world needs to recognize that Yahweh set those boundaries for Eretz-Yisra'el even before his people entered the land. Based on those few words in those two chapters, the whole Western world of today needs to take great care that they do not support the chant that we hear constantly, that the territory west of the Yarden River belongs to the Palestinians. That was never Yahweh's intention. And as we read in the Lamentations this morning, Jerusalem, has twice been overpowered by the nations and left in an unwanted ruin. But following the return of her people in 1948, the city began to be restored and rebuilt. But even then, the city remained divided for another 19 years until that Six-Day War of 1967. Yahweh returned sovereignty of that city to his people Israel during that war. Yet even then, they were not ready to take full control and restore her to her former glory. It will not be until Yeshua returns as Ben David, the conquering king, that his city will finally be restored to her former glory and controlled under the guidance of his people. Only then will the words that we read in Yeshayahu or Isaiah chapters 58 and 60, will Jerusalem once again be not only the focal point and the capital of Israel, but it will also be the capital of all the nations of the restored world. As Yeshayahu chapter 60 verses 13 and 14 say, the glory of Lebanon will come to you, cypresses together with elm trees and larches, to beautify the site of my sanctuary. I will glorify the place where I stand. The children of your oppressors will come and bow down before me. All those who despise you will fall at your feet, calling you the city of Yahweh, Zion, the Holy One of Israel. These are strong words from Yahweh that can be directed straight at Hezbollah. Even though they are presently provoking Israel, they will be crushed by the angelic forces that will accompany Yeshua at his return. Also, just a few sentences earlier, in chapter 60, verses 10 and 12 through 12, we read how foreigners will be rebuilding your walls. Their kings will be at your service. For my anger I struck you, and in my mercy I pity you. Your gates will always be open, and they will not be shut by day or by night, so that the people can bring the wealth of the nations, with their kings leading the procession. The nation or kingdom that won't serve will perish. Yes, those nations will be utterly destroyed. So the question may well be asked, why did Yahweh bring about the modern state of Israel so far in advance of the return of Yeshua? The reason Yahweh restored Yehudah back to the land in 1948 was the same reason that he allowed Yehudah to return after the 70-year exile in Babylon. That first return was to enable Yeshua to come in the midst of his people during his earthly ministry, and through his sacrificial death, he paved the way for all mankind to be restored. In the same way, by allowing many of Yehudah, the people of Yehudah, after the Holocaust to return in such large numbers in 1948, turns the focus of the world upon, firstly, the whole territory promised to Abraham and also to Jerusalem, which, of course, in 1967 was removed from the clutches of the Gentile world. But, as we read in Romans chapter 10, verses 1 to 8, Israel as a people were not ready to take full responsibility for the sovereignty. So they handed the control of the Temple Mount back into the hands of the Jordanian Wak. As Shaul says in Romans chapter 10, verses 4 and 5, for the goal at which the Torah aims is the Messiah, who offers righteousness to everyone who trusts. For For Moshe writes about righteousness grounded in Torah, that the person who does these things will attain life through them. But Shaul also continues by saying in chapter 11, verses 7 and 8, what follows is that Israel had not yet attained the full goal for which she was striving. But for the ones who have obtained it, the rest have been made stone-like. Just as the Tanakh says, God has given them a spirit of dullness, eyes that do not see and ears that do not hear, right down to this present day. However, there is no excuse for the nations of the world to abuse or reject Israel as a national body, as they are all doing at this present time. Because Shaul remonstrates with the nations in chapter 11, verse 11 through 12, I say, isn't it that they have stumbled, with the result that they have permanently fallen away? Heaven forbid. Quite the contrary. It is by means of their stumbling that deliverance has come to the Gentiles, in order to provoke them to jealousy. Moreover, if their stumbling is bringing riches to the latter, how much greater the riches will be when Israel reaches its fullness. So, as Shaul said in verse 8, while the majority of modern Israel have been made stone-like, the condition should stand as a severe warning to the nations of the world that they will be treated in exactly the same way as Israel has been treated in the past. All the nations need to recognize that Yeshua will bring an end to the collective sovereignty when the Arab nations will align themselves against the beast. In Daniel chapter 7, verses 11 through 12, he said, I kept watching, and there, because of the arrogant words of the horn that was speaking, I watched as the animal was killed. Its body was destroyed, and it was given over to be burned up completely. As for the other animals, their rulership was taken away, but their lives were prolonged for a time and a season. These are things that are soon to happen. The beast will rise, and the nations will give their authority to the beast, so that they will try to bring an end to Israel. But the nations are being put on notice. So when that day of Yeshua's return does arrive, it will be clearly seen that in keeping with the sovereign plan of God, Israel certainly will not be a lost cause. Shabbat Shalom.